What if the secret to resilience wasn't in money or power, but in food? Ellis Island wasn't just where immigrants crossed into America. It's where they fought to survive one meal at a time. Behind those immigration lines and medical exams were families with nothing but their dreams, and recipes written in memory, not ink. From 1892 to 1954, Ellis Island stood at the mouth of New York Harbor, welcoming over 12 million immigrants from countries like Ireland, Italy, Russia, Poland, and beyond. And while they arrived with almost nothing, their cooking traditions planted the early seeds of what we now recognize as American cuisine. These 25 survival meals weren't luxury or indulgence. They were born from hunger, hardship, and heart, but they also carried bold flavor, resourcefulness, and legacy. Let's travel back through a menu carved from struggle, one dish at a time. By the end of this journey, you may never look at your dinner plate the same way again. Before we dive into the first dish, here's a quick favor to ask. If stories of perseverance, culture, and forgotten recipes speak to you, hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it helps keep these powerful histories alive, one meal at a time. And let us know in the comments, which heritage dish reminds you of your roots? Buckwheat Kasha with caramelized onions? To Eastern European immigrants, change came fast, but one food stayed constant: Kasha. A simple pot of boiled buckwheat groats, topped with onions fried in lard or goose fat, was more than a meal. It was an anchor. In crowded tenements, 1 cup of buckwheat became a family's lifeline, feeding fathers headed to dock work, children working their way through school days, and mothers mixing in the tiniest scraps to stretch each serving. The magic of Kasha lies in its balance: cheap, filling, and above all, familiar. Amid loud cities and strange languages, the nutty aroma of buckwheat was a memory of quiet farms and home kitchens. And once the onions hit the hot pan, the smell didn't just fill a room, it wrapped it in comfort. Even today, you can buy buckwheat for under $5 a bag. Sauté some onions, boil the grain, and for less than the price of a sandwich, you'll have a meal strong enough to hold a family together. For immigrants trying to survive in a new world, this dish meant more than calories. It meant, we can make it. Potato babka. If survival had a signature dish, it was potato babka, improvised sustenance turned golden. Immigrants from Poland and Belarus brought over this oven-baked staple, and in the kitchens of New York's tenements, it was transformed into an edible lifeline. With nothing more than grated potatoes, onions, and a dusting of flour, families pressed the mixture into pans and baked it until the top crisped like a crust of hope, while the interior stayed soft and rich. It wasn't just economical, it was efficient. 1 pan could last through the week. Kids had thick slices before trudging to school. Fathers wrapped bricks in newspaper for their factory lunches, and Sundays were special. An egg or pat of butter turned this humble loaf into something like celebration. Potatoes, even now, remain one of the most affordable foods. $3 gets you 5 pounds. Potato babka lit the way for immigrants who couldn't afford much, but still found a way to bake love into survival. This wasn't just bread. It was proof that something made from scraps could still hold dignity. Sour rice soup with hard-boiled eggs. Żurek wasn't just soup, it was survival with a sour twist. For many Polish immigrants, the steaming bowl of fermented rye broth was the closest thing to home served thousands of miles away. It started with nothing more than a jar of rye starter, left out to ferment for days. Add garlic, maybe a potato if you had one, and suddenly a few cents could feed a family all week. The tangy earthiness stood in contrast to American foods, but for new arrivals, it was pure comfort. When the budget allowed, a hard-boiled egg was sliced in, meatless but meaningful. Most couldn't afford sausage, so the egg became the dish's crown jewel. Children would dip bread into the sharp, creamy bowl, savoring every drop. Today, rye flour still costs under $3, and eggs remain a go-to source of affordable protein. Żurek taught immigrant families how to stretch their imagination as far as their ingredients. That sour taste they grew up with? It reminded them that where they came from mattered, even here. Cabbage and barley skillet. For Slavic immigrants, cabbage was a currency in the kitchen, plentiful, dependable, and always up to the task. One dish made it shine: a simple skillet of cabbage and barley, slow cooked into sustenance. You didn't need meat. Just shredded cabbage, a few spoonfuls of barley, an onion if you had one, and some fat scraped from last week's pan. Cook it down in a single pot, and it became a meal durable enough to stretch over several days. Kids slurped it down before school. Fathers tucked tin cups full of it into lunch pails. Mothers seasoned it with salt and pepper, rarely more. But the way barley's nuttiness played off the sweetness of softened cabbage. It hit deep. Fast forward to today. Barley still sells for around $2, cabbage under $1 a head. Pair them, and you have a dish any Ellis Island family would recognize with a smile. It wasn't glamour. It was grit. A whisper that said, "We're not rich, but we're not hungry." Herring and beet salad with vinegar dressing. Long before food stylists and Instagram plates, there was beet and herring salad, a festival of frugality that fed spirits as much as stomachs. In tiny kitchens filled with too many people and too little space, Eastern European immigrants creatively mixed boiled beets, chopped onions and slivers of salted herring. A vinegar-based dressing zapped the senses, balancing the beet's sweetness with the fish's briny boldness. It wasn't indulgent, but it was practical genius. One preserved fillet could flavor an entire bowl, with vegetables doing the heavy lifting. Families passed plates around crowded tables where waste was not an option and nutrition was a negotiation. To children, the saltiness could be a shock, but hunger quickly overruled picky taste buds. Households often paired it with black bread, soaking up every last bit until there was nothing but clean plates. Today, canned or salted herring runs under $3. Beets are one of the cheapest and healthiest root veggies. Through this simple salad, families learned that with a little vinegar and vision, even the darkest times had color, taste, and strength. Onion and bread dumpling soup. To many German and Sudeten immigrants, survival began with an old loaf of bread, too tough to chew, too precious to waste. From this, they created something both humble and heartwarming. Onion and bread dumpling soup. Day-old crusts were grated or torn into pieces, softened with a bit of water or egg if the family had one, and rolled into rough dumplings. These were dropped into an onion broth, a broth often flavored with nothing but thyme, salt, and the bittersweet aroma of caramelized onions. In the poorly heated apartments of New York, this soup warmed much more than chilled fingers. It warmed spirits worn thin from factory shifts and long days in a foreign land. Children loved the treasure hunt of pulling dumplings from steaming bowls, and adults cherished how a few scraps of bread could masquerade as a meal. Once in a while, when butter or meat drippings were available, a spoonful was added, lifting the broth into unexpected richness. But the essence endured: bread, onion, and care. Even in today's world, bread and onions remain among the cheapest foods in the store. This soup was proof that with just a few forgotten crusts and a whisper of flavor, poverty could still taste like comfort. Buckwheat blini with sour cream and salted fish. To Russian and Ukrainian immigrants, blini were never just pancakes. They were culinary heritage folded into warmth. Skillet by skillet, made from humble buckwheat flour and water, maybe a splash of milk if anyone was lucky. These thin pancakes cooked quickly on cast iron surfaces worn from use. Their earthy aroma filled kitchens that were modest in size, but rich in memory. On most days, a spoonful of sour cream and a sliver of salted herring crowned the blini. Families sliced the fish paper-thin to stretch its salty essence. Every bite was a quiet celebration, a survival tactic wrapped in tradition. Children gathered around as the batter hissed and bubbled, their hunger met by the smell of frying dough and the tang in the air. Even in the coldest apartments, the blini made it feel, just for a moment, like a celebration. They weren't just food. They were Sunday rituals revived on weekday mornings, a taste of old lands flipped golden in a new world. And today, a single $5 bag of buckwheat flour still yields stacks. A plate of blini delivers something few meals can, an edible bridge to where we come from. Lentil and garlic stew with black bread. Sometimes survival doesn't shout, it simmers. In Ellis Island kitchens, lentil and garlic stew was the quiet backbone of sustenance. Quietly feeding futures on nickels and nutrition, lentils were cheap, lasted forever, and packed enough protein to face days spent unloading cargo. Sewing in factories, or simply battling the fatigue of poverty. Families slow-cooked them with whatever they had. Onion, garlic, maybe a carrot or celery scrap pulled from a week-old bin. The aroma that filled the room was deep and earthy, heavy with the scent of endurance. Then came the black bread, thick, rye-heavy, baked to last. Sliced and dipped into the stew, the bread absorbed every drop like a sponge soaking up survival. Adults appreciated its power. Kids loved its simplicity. School, work, exhaustion. This one-pot wonder fueled them through it all. More than a century later, lentils still cost barely $2 a bag. For immigrants, this stew wasn't trendy. It was truth in a bowl. A meal that reminded them every spoonful was progress. Every bite, a signal that scarcity couldn't stop them. Quick moment before we continue. If this journey through Ellis Island kitchens is speaking to your heart or sparking ideas in your own kitchen, don't forget to subscribe. New episodes explore lost recipes, immigrant flavors, and stories our cookbooks forgot. Also, we'd love to hear from you. Drop your favorite comfort meal or a family food memory in the comments below. Your voice is part of this story too. Rice and cabbage dolma. To Balkan and Ottoman immigrants, dolma was more than food. It was a quiet act of craftsmanship, passed from mother to daughter at kitchen tables. Even in the hardest of times, they'd start by boiling cabbage heads until the leaves softened and could be carefully peeled. These leaves, tender as paper, were then rolled around a fragrant blend of rice, onions, and herbs. For families who could rarely afford meat, the filling was almost always vegetarian, but never lacking in flavor. Each roll was simmered slowly in a savory tomato broth. The result? Compact parcels packed with purpose and flavor. Children competed for the smallest rolls, and mothers took pride in their handiwork, stretching a handful of rice into a meal that could nourish 10 mouths. In those cramped kitchens, the aroma of garlic and simmering cabbage was almost sacred. It wasn't just tradition, it was triumph. Even today, you can buy rice for a few dollars and cabbage for under $1. It's not about extravagance. Dolma shows that with patience, love, and skill, you can wrap an entire world in a single leaf. Millet porridge with honey and walnuts. Before oatmeal dominated breakfast, there was millet porridge, the working-class morning masterpiece. For Central and Eastern European immigrants, it was the day starter of choice, warming, weighty, and wonderfully affordable. At Ellis Island, families simmered millet until it thickened into a golden mush. On hard days, it was eaten plain, but when fortune smiled, a drizzle of honey lifted it with sweetness. On rare, memorable mornings, chopped walnuts were added, the crunch transforming this humble porridge into something that felt almost indulgent. Children ate it before school, clinging to its warmth as they stepped into crowded streets. Fathers ate it after double shifts, the rich texture restoring what the day had taken out. Even leftovers weren't wasted. The porridge was chilled overnight, sliced and fried in pans the next morning. Millet still costs just a few dollars for a large bag. With minimal effort, it can feed a family for days. But for immigrants, this wasn't just breakfast, it was a symbol. A reminder that even in the cold, even in a new place, there could be warmth, nourishment, and fleeting moments of joy. Potato knish. Step onto the bustling streets of the Lower East Side a century ago, and you could smell home in the air, not from mansions, but from push carts. And nothing embodied that more than the beloved potato knish. For Jewish immigrants, this flaky golden hand pie was more than a savory snack. It was portable warmth, handheld survival, and soul food wrapped in dough. Inside, mashed potatoes mixed with sautéed onions created a filling that was both hearty and humble. Knishes were made at home with leftovers, rolled out by mothers who turned scraps into sustenance. Others were grabbed piping hot from street vendors, costing just a few pennies, perfect for workers grabbing a bite during a break or for children on their way to school. You didn't need utensils. Just your hands, your hunger, and a little salt. That was the genius of the knish. It was survival in a sleeve. Potatoes and onions remain among the cheapest, most versatile foods today. But to Ellis Island families, a knish was much more than efficient fuel. It was resilience you could carry, and a piece of identity you could eat on the go. Brown bread and molasses pudding. For Irish immigrants, dessert wasn't whipped cream or rich chocolate. It was a bowl of memories disguised as sweet sustenance, like brown bread and molasses pudding, a dish that whispered of home and survival in the same spoonful. It began with bread that had gone stale, not waste, but raw material. Soaked in milk, mashed together with blackstrap molasses, and baked until set, the pudding transformed old crusts into something warm and comforting. The bold sweetness of molasses was familiar to Irish families who couldn't afford sugar back home. In America, it became a marker of both heritage and practicality. The pudding was often the only dessert children tasted all week. On Sundays, mothers sliced it into squares, while fathers reclaimed rest and strength with each sticky bite. In the poorest homes, this modest treat brought a sense of celebration. Molasses was cheap. Bread often came free. Combined, they created a little joy in the bleakest kitchens. For Ellis Island families, this wasn't just dessert. It was how they baked dignity and delight into scraps and called it enough. Chickpea and carrot stew with paprika. If ever there was proof that flavor doesn't follow money, it's found in a pot of chickpea and carrot stew. For immigrants from the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, chickpeas were the kind of humble hero that didn't ask for much yet delivered everything. Dried, durable, protein-packed. They were ready for hard times. When cooked slowly with sweet carrots and a dusting of vibrant paprika, they created a stew that was both simple and astonishingly satisfying. The paprika, whether smoked or sharp, brought depth, warmth, and memory. Neighbors followed their noses through tenement hallways as the pot simmered. Families stretched the broth with whatever was handy: rice, potatoes, leftover bread. Kids dunked chunks into the thick red broth, while adults ladled bowls carefully, savoring every lentil-sized win. Today, a bag of dried chickpeas and a bunch of carrots still cost just a few dollars. But their value was never just economical. This wasn't a poor man's stew. It was a lesson in turning modest means into a masterpiece of comfort. Old World sauerkraut and mushroom pierogi. In the hands of Polish and Ukrainian immigrants, pierogi were more than dumplings. They were devotion sealed in dough. On Ellis Island, these half-moon miracles carried tastes of distant villages into noisy new neighborhoods. Thin sheets of dough, stretched lovingly by hand, were stuffed with a mix of tart sauerkraut and earthy mushrooms. Meat was rare, but cabbage and wild mushrooms held deep flavor, and together they stood strong. To the parents folding the dough alongside their children, this was a passing down of craft and culture, not just calories. The pierogi boiled in battered pots, floating like memories. If onions or butter were available, they got a quick fry to add richness. But even naked from the pan, these dumplings fed entire families, 10 mouths from one humble pile of dough. Today, flour, cabbage, and mushrooms remain among the cheapest pantry staples. But pierogi offered something more intangible, a way to hold onto identity in a world that asked you to let go. Dandelion greens and egg scramble. Sometimes survival meant seeing food where others saw weeds. For many immigrants, dandelion greens weren't garden waste. They were a wild gift that turned hunger into dinner. Growing freely in alleyways, yards and city lots, dandelion greens were gathered by children sent out with baskets. Back in the kitchens, mothers sautéed them in fat with onions or garlic, then scrambled in an egg or two, stretching the dish far enough to feed the entire family. The greens, once bitter and tough, became tender and bright when cooked just right. The eggs added richness and stayed economical, just enough protein to make it stick. What made this dish memorable wasn't just the taste, it was the resourcefulness. Kids learned to forage with purpose, and families knew to appreciate what grew for free all around them. Each bite of greens wasn't just nourishing, it was empowering. Even now, dandelion greens can be foraged or bought cheap. Eggs are still affordable, and the message remains clear. When you have sharp eyes and a willing spirit, even the weeds can become supper. Salt cod and potato fritters. To Portuguese and Azorean immigrants, salt cod wasn't just food. It was tradition preserved in salt, carried across oceans in barrels, trunks, and memory. Bacalhau, as it was called, was soaked and softened after its long cure, then flaked into mashed potatoes with a bit of onion and parsley. No flourished garnishes, no butter-heavy pan, just survival, shaped by hand into patties and fried until golden brown. These fritters weren't showy, but they were smart. A single piece of fish could stretch across the whole batch, feeding children right out of the pan while their fathers packed a few warm cakes into their dented lunch tins for long days on the docks. Their crisp edges, salty centers, and potato fluff made them stick to the ribs. They were fortified with more than just calories. These were bites of home, fried in defiance of scarcity. Even now, salt cod is affordable and shelf-stable. Potatoes cost next to nothing. For immigrant families, survival came stacked in fritters, portable, shareable, and symbolic of a heritage they refused to let go. Stewed apples with hard bread and cinnamon. Sometimes the sweetest things didn't require sugar, just wisdom, warmth, and bruised fruit. For many immigrant families, dessert meant making magic out of what others called waste. Stewed apples with hard bread and a pinch of cinnamon turned nearly nothing into comfort. Old or bruised apples were bought cheap at the market, or collected for free from leftovers. Peeled, sliced, and stewed with a tiny spoon of molasses or sugar, they became tender and fragrant, softening until they glistened like jam. Hard bread, often days stale, was cubed and laid underneath, soaking up the apple juices like a sponge. The transformation was subtle but powerful. From sour and dry came warm, rich, and satisfying. If you had cinnamon, just a dusting turned ordinary into treasured ritual. It was dessert without indulgence, joy without price tags. Even now, apples and stale bread can be found just about anywhere, often free if you ask. What this dish proved was simple. Sweetness isn't about abundance. It's about what you do with what's left. Oat and prune breakfast cakes. A stack of oat and prune cakes wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to take on the world when little else was certain. For countless Ellis Island families, this was how the day began, humble, hearty, and homemade. Rolled oats were mixed with mashed, soaked prunes, formed into thin patties, and fried with whatever fat was available, chicken grease, lard or margarine from the bottom of a tin. The texture was dense and chewy, the kind of food that filled you from morning until late. You didn't need syrup or toppings, just warmth, texture, and the slow-burning energy of oats and dried fruit. When luck allowed, a little honey or sugar dust elevated it into something to smile about. Children carried them to school wrapped in brown paper. Parents relied on them through shifts that stretched sunrise to nightfall. Every bite was modest but dependable. Oats and prunes are still budget staples today, lasting months in any pantry. But these cakes were never just about cost. They were about a morning promise. We may have little, but we're not going hungry. Cabbage and dried pea mash. For Scandinavian immigrants, strength came from the simplest combination. Peas and cabbage, Earth's humble gifts boiled into survival. This mash wasn't photogenic, but in the world of tenement kitchens and leftover pots, taste could be deceiving. Dried peas placed into water softened over hours. Add shredded cabbage and let it melt into the mix. Salt, pepper, maybe a scrape of pork fat if luck allowed. It didn't need more. The result was thick, warm, and surprisingly rich in depth. Children scooped it by the bowlful with wooden spoons. Men carried it in tin cups to the yard, the rail yard, or the shipyard. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to last. What lingered wasn't bitterness. It was sweetness. The cabbage mellowed, the peas creamy and filling. It was humble in look, massive in meaning. A message stirred into each batch. You don't need meat to fight another day. You need fuel, and families knew how to make it. Dried peas and cabbage still cost very little. But they carried families far, proving that no frills doesn't mean no nourishment. Barley and turnip potage with parsley oil. In cold, drafty kitchens of tenement blocks, immigrants from rural Europe often turned to what they knew best: barley, turnips, and the slow, sacred art of simmering patience into a meal. This potage wasn't fancy, but it was careful. Barley added its signature chew and nutty depth. Turnips surrendered the bitterness of rawness and mellowed into sweetness as they boiled down over hours. The result was a spoon-thick soup that stuck to your bones and kept hunger away. And then came a splash of something remarkable: parsley oil. Just chopped herbs, leftover or foraged, mashed into whatever fat you had, then spooned across the top. It didn't just add color. It brought brightness to an otherwise gray meal. Families passed bowls of it around the table. The steam fogging cracked windows as hands shared warmth and nourishment. Barley and turnips are still among the cheapest staples you can buy. But this potage wasn't about ingredients. It was about this. If you cook with time and care, even roots and grain can feel like shelter. Black bread with rendered goose fat spread? To Jewish and Eastern European immigrants, a slice of black bread was more than a meal. It was a ritual of identity, a taste of where they came from. Heavy with rye flour, dense, dark, and sour, this bread lived in their suitcases long before it reached their tables in America. But what turned it into a true survival meal was simplicity at its finest: rendered goose fat. In households where butter was out of reach, every last drop of fat from a rare roast goose was saved, cooled, stored, spread across thin slices like liquid gold. It was fatty, flavorful, and filling. One slice before school could get a child through the day. Fathers tucked thick slabs into lunch tins. When there was enough fat left over, onions were fried straight into it, then smeared atop the bread, transforming survival into something close to indulgence. Today, rye bread is still just a few dollars. And while rendered fat has fallen out of fashion, it was once a prized treasure for immigrant kitchens. This wasn't gluttony. It was resourcefulness layered with heritage. Proof that when butter is out of reach, culture still finds a way to nourish. Buckwheat and onion-stuffed cabbage rolls. You could smell love wrapped in boiled cabbage. For Eastern European immigrants, stuffed cabbage rolls, whether called golubtsi or holubtsi, were edible care packages. Filled with buckwheat, caramelized onions, and memory, meat was rare but no one lacked flavor. Boiled cabbage leaves became canvases, folded tightly around nutty groats and slow-browned onions. A sprinkle of herbs added life, rolled up carefully and lined in battered metal pots. They simmered in tomato broth when it was available, or just salted water. Mothers taught their children the art of rolling each leaf, while fathers counted how many fit in their lunch tins. There was joy in sharing something that came from almost nothing. These rolls were more than dinner. They were a mother's handwriting passed through flavor, a grandmother's rhythm stitched into every fold. Today, both cabbage and buckwheat remain extremely inexpensive. But this dish stands tall, because in every bite, immigrants wrapped not just grains, but hope, grace, and stubborn love. Sweet carrot and raisin kugel. Kugel wasn't just a dish. It was a quiet Sabbath rising from the noise of immigrant life. And the sweet version, made with carrots and raisins, gave Jewish families on Ellis Island a reason to breathe, even if only for a meal. Carrots were grated into ribbons and mixed with cooked noodles, held together by what little sweetening the kitchen could afford. Raisins plumped in water, a hint of sugar or cinnamon if it was payday. Then everything went into a battered baking dish, coming out as a golden, firm-cut casserole. This was food for memories. The kind mothers baked on makeshift stoves, slicing into squares and whispering stories buried under work weeks. Children embraced the warm, sweet smell as it drifted through hallways scented with laundry, onions, and iron. For many, this was the week's only treat, the edible memory of Shabbat, a pause in the midst of survival, even now. Noodles, carrots, and raisins are pantry regulars. But kugel isn't about ingredients. It's about taking ordinary things and baking them into rituals that reminded families they still had reason to gather. Pickled beet and potato salad with horseradish. Tangy, bold, and bright, this wasn't your basic side dish. It was an immigrant invention born from long winters and longer shifts. For Eastern European families struggling with tight budgets, pickled beet and potato salad with horseradish was a firework of flavor in a gray week. Potatoes and beets were cheap, sturdy, and made to last. Combined, they became something beautiful and economical. Once cooled and sliced, they were dressed with grated horseradish, fresh or jarred, creating a sharp contrast that kicked the taste buds wide awake. It was colorful, spicy, unexpected. Kids weren't always convinced, but they warmed to it. Fathers packed jars of it for long days at work. Mothers served it cold, stretching it to last across meals and days with no waste. Even in small apartments with one burner and a crowded table, this salad brought presence. It didn't whisper, it shouted survival with flavor. Today, beets and potatoes are still deeply affordable. Horseradish remains underrated. This salad proves that when money runs thin, flavor doesn't have to. Dried fruit and nut compote with honey. When there was something to celebrate, but hardly anything in the pantry, immigrant families turned to one precious dish: dried fruit and nut compote. This wasn't about indulgence. It was about honoring what little sweetness could be found and savoring it together. Whether made with prunes, raisins, walnuts, or almonds, whatever was on hand was chopped, simmered with care and sweetened with a drizzle of honey. Every spoonful was sticky, fragrant, and full of energy. This was never an everyday treat. It came out on holidays, on birthdays. After long weeks where nothing felt certain, children perked up as the smell filled the air. Fathers, tired from heavy labor, sat down to slow spoonfuls, each one tasting of celebration and something familiar they couldn't quite name. Even now, dried fruit remains inexpensive. Honey, still a simple luxury, adds soul. This compote wasn't just dessert, it was what resilience tastes like. The flavor of perseverance sweetened by faith that the hard days wouldn't last forever. If you look closely, you'll see these dishes were never just about staying fed. They were about staying human, about turning scraps and leftovers into love and survival. From buckwheat kasha to sweet raisin kugel, each recipe held more than flavor. It held identity. It held patience. It held a family's belief that tomorrow might be just a little bit better. With every recipe passed down, new stories were written. Stories of sacrifice, innovation, and undying resolve. These foods built more than full stomachs. They built bridges between the old world and the new. They taught that you don't need wealth to celebrate. You don't need fancy tools for flavor. And you don't need luxury to love those you feed. In 2025, the lessons still hold. Because when you stir memory into your pot, when you stretch ingredients with intention, and when you sit together, however humble the dish, that's more than dinner, that's legacy. So the next time you're standing in a kitchen wondering what to make with almost nothing, think of who came before you. They were hungry, too, and they changed the world. One simple meal at a time.